Hello, everybody. How are you today? Well, we are here for another Bible story reading. For those of you joining for the first time, let me tell you what goes on here. We do Bible story readings for people who don't know what the Bible stories are. Maybe you've never read them for yourself. Nobody's read them to you. You just haven't heard them for some reason. Or maybe you have forgotten what they say. Well, we go through the different stories so that you can know them for yourself. We go live on Facebook, but if you're watching this on YouTube, we take the video and we upload it after it's live on Facebook to YouTube. So hit that like and subscribe button. We've been going through the story of David. David, he was the second king of Israel. And we've been going through this story. We are now towards the end, not the very end, but we're getting close to the end of 2 Samuel. And right now we are on chapter 21. So what has happened, just to kind of recap, is for a little while, David kind of got ousted from the palace by his son. He came back, kind of put some things back in order, and now he's been reigning as king. So we're going to pick up with chapter 21. During David's reign, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David inquired of the Lord. The Lord answered, "It is due to Saul and his bloody family because he killed the Gibeonites." The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but rather a remnant of the Amorites. The Israelites had taken an oath concerning them, but Saul had tried to kill them in his zeal for the Israelites in Judah. So David summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. He asked the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you? How can I make atonement to you so that it will bring a blessing on the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites said to him, "We are not asking for silver or gold from Saul or his family, and we cannot put anyone to death in Israel." "Whatever you say, I will do for you," he said. They replied to the king, "As for the man who annihilated us and plotted to destroy us so we would not exist within the whole territory of Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be handed over to us so we may hang them in the presence of the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen." The king answered, "I will hand them over." But David spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between David and Jonathan, Saul's son. But the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, who were the 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of Ai, born to Saul, and the 5 sons who Merab, daughter of Saul, had born to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite, and handed them over to the Gibeonites. They hanged them on the hill in the presence of the Lord, and 7 of them died together. They were executed in the first days of the harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Rizpah, Ai's daughter, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until the rain poured down from heaven on the bodies. She kept the birds of the sky from them by day and the wild animals by night. When it was reported to David what Saul's concubine Rizpah, daughter of Ai, had done, he went and got the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. They had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung the bodies the day the Philistines killed Saul at Gibeah. David had the bones brought from there. They gathered up the bones of Saul's family who had been hanged and buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan at Zelah in the land of Benjamin, in the tomb of Saul's father Kish. They did everything the king commanded. After this, God was receptive to the prayer for the land. The Philistines again waged war against Israel. David went down with his soldiers and they fought the Philistines, but David had become exhausted. Then Ishbi-Bonab, one of the descendants of the giant whose bronze spear weighed about 8 pounds, and who wore new armor, intended to kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to his aid, struck the Philistine, and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, "You must never again go out with us to battle. You must not extinguish the lamp of Israel." After this, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sibbecai, the Hushath, killed Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giant. Once again, there was a battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of Origim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath of Gath. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. At Gath, there was still another battle. A huge man was there with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was descendant from the giant. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of David's brother Shemel, killed him. These 4 were descendant from the giant in Gath and were killed by David and his soldiers. And that's how chapter 21 of 2 Samuel ends. Well, this is just kind of an odd chapter. So there are 3 ways that we look at these stories, these chapters, when we read them. 1, what does it say? We have to have reading comprehension. If you don't read the words on the page, if you don't read these, you have no idea what it says. You only know what somebody has told you it says. Next, we have to understand what it was saying to the people of the time. We have to take everything into context. We have to understand the history. We have to understand the backstory. We have to know what's going on. If we were to just pull this chapter out and read it, we wouldn't understand very much of what's happened here. And last, what, if anything, is it saying to us today? Before we dissect this, I want to explain to you that David is now a very old man. When we began the story of David, when we started in 1 Samuel, he was a young shepherd boy. In fact, David may not have actually even been born when we first started with this, when Samuel was alive and a priest. But at some point, David comes into the picture here, and he is anointed by God when he is a young teenage boy. He's just a young little shepherd boy. And sometimes we still think of David as this young, brawny character, when in fact many, many years have taken place, and David is now an older man. He has sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters. He's slower now in his old age, and he's winding down. Well, during this part of his reign, there's a famine. And David doesn't understand why it's taking so long for God to send rain. It's been 3 years. So he goes and he inquires of the Lord, which is something that David was real good at. He always wanted to hear from God. And so he asked God, why are we having this famine? And God says to him, he says, it's because way back when Saul was king, he tried to destroy the Gibeonites. And I did not tell him to do that. In fact, the Gibeonites are people that your people had an oath with at one time. So David decides he's going to make this right in order for it to rain again. So he goes to the Gibeonites. He says, what would you like for me to do to make this right? Anything you want, I will do. And they say to him, well, we don't want gold and we don't want silver. And certainly we're not going to kill anybody from Israel. That would be wrong. So he says, all right, what would you like me to do? And they said, we want the lives of the descendants of the man who tried to have us killed. And David decides that sounds fair. So he goes and he rounds up 7 of Saul's descendants, all except for Mephibosheth, because Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son that David had taken an oath with Jonathan and promised to take care of. So he wasn't going to break that oath. So he spared Mephibosheth. Now later we'll see there's another Mephibosheth that is not spared. So he goes, he gets these seven men, these 7 descendants, and they take them and hang them for the Gibeonites in public. And they're happy with the outcome of that, and evidently God is too. Now, meanwhile, Rizpah, who was Ai's daughter, one of the people that is killed, she takes sackcloth and spreads it out for herself on this rock from the beginning of the harvest. Now, when this happened, when all of this happened, it was the start of the barley harvest. Okay? But remember, there hadn't been any rain, so it hadn't rained yet. And she spreads the sackcloth out until it starts to rain again. And David hears of her faithfulness, so he goes and he gets the bones of Jonathan and of Saul, and he brings them back and lets them have a peaceful burial. And then that just sort of ends. That's it. We hear about that. That's it. And this is many, many, many years, probably a few decades after the death of Jonathan and Saul. Well, now, for whatever reason, we don't know what was in their mind and what started it, but the Philistines decided, hey, let's start a war again with Israel. This time, David goes down with his soldiers to fight against the Philistines. Boy, those Philistines are just always pricking them in the side, aren't they? And so they go down to fight. David goes with them. But David is an old man now, and he becomes very tired, and he almost gets killed until somebody steps in and takes care of this giant that's going to kill him and kills him for him. And they say to David, you cannot fight in battle anymore, King. We can't let you do that, because if you die, then the lamp of Israel goes out. They recognize that David was a light to the people. He was the anointed. He was chosen by God to lead these people. He was anointed and chosen. And so they don't let him fight anymore. And that is David's last fighting battle. But then there's another battle and another battle. And this goes on, but in all of the battles, the Israelites prevail. They win. And all of a sudden, the chapter just ends. So we find out here, if you remember, way back when Saul was king, he wanted Judah and he wanted Israel. He wanted to be a powerful king and he wanted to reign over them. He thought he was entitled, since God had anointed him, to do whatever he wanted to do. But one of the things he was not supposed to do was hurt the Gibeonites, because God had an oath between Israel and the Gibeonites. And God said, you're not supposed to hurt them. But Saul didn't care about that. He was more interested in gaining power. So here it is some decades later, and God remembers that. So what do we take away from that? One of the things that we know is when God says something, he means it. He is not a God to forget. He is not a God to change his mind. And he is not a God to not bring justice to the people who deserve it. So he remembered the plight of the Gibeonites. And he decides to withhold the rain from Israel. Now, most people would have just gone about their daily lives and said, oh, boy, hasn't rained for a while. Oh, I wish it would rain. I can hear them down at the coffee shop, all the farmers getting together saying, boy, I wish it would rain. Yeah, it's been a while since we've had rain. I don't know what we're going to do this year for a crop. But David says, I think there's something more to this. This isn't just not rain. And I need to ask God why he's withholding the rain. So God knew that if he withheld the rain for a period of time, eventually David would say, what do we need to do, God, to make this right? What do we need to do to make this right? So when God explains to David, it's because of the Gibeonites. I'm having compassion on them. And I think you need to make right what had been done to them by Saul. When David agrees, then the rain gets sent to them. We forget sometimes that God is just, that things in this life don't just randomly happen. Sometimes they do, and it rains on the just and the unjust, and bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. Life is life. But in this particular case, this was a pretty bad drought. And God heard the amends that David made to the Gibeonites. And he blessed David because of that. So when these battles came against him, when the drought came against him, as long as David continued to seek out God and answers from God, then God continued to bless David. So that's what I take away from 2 Samuel chapter 21. Maybe you got something completely different out of it. I don't know. But it's an interesting chapter. Excuse me. It's an interesting chapter. And the next time that we get together, we're going to read something that is very different from what we generally read. You know, generally we read a story. But in the next chapter, it's not so much a story as we're going to read a song. So I look forward to us being together next time. In the meantime, I hope you learned something. God bless you and have a great day.